Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of Nightlight. Tonight we have Dr. EARL SHOWERMAN returning. He was here only a couple months ago with Catherine Children promoting the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference. You got to see Earl about a week later on Chris Jordan's Curious Realm. And let's see, and Chris did a fantastic job. About a week later, reporting on location in Denver. That was a terrific show he did. Barbara and I had a pleasant collaboration with Chris. Earl was the guest on the Blue Board last month. We'll get into that as well. So Earl's been appearing all over media over the last couple months, and you'll see why he's in such high demand. And you can also find his writings in the Oxfordian. And he's in number 25. And he also contributed a chapter to The Contested Year, which we'll talk about a little bit as well. But hi, Earl.
Mark, thank you so much for inviting me back. And it does seem this year has been a big year for me in terms of getting out there and having my voice spread across media that normally we don't have opportunity to reach out to. So I appreciate the invitation to come back and expand further on our question of the whole Shakespeare attribution, and glad to help.
Oh, yeah. I think we only did 65, 70 minutes. I don't. A couple months ago, it wasn't like a full 2-hour show, but there's easily a lot more that we haven't gotten into, and we're going to be doing that tonight. But before, I have a whole bunch of pages front and back of notes, and this might be another show where you hear the desk just crash through the floor with all the weight of the books on it. But you did. The interview with Chris, it's kind of like a warm up for, when he brought in 6 of the speakers from the conference. I thought it was, Chris as well as all the, Catherine, all the other speakers did a terrific job as well. What are some of the reports from the conference? Seemed like the speakers were, excited to continue the conversation with Chris.
Oh, he was great there. He set up in the lobby right outside
Mm-hmm.
the conference center itself where we were having our lectures, and everybody walking in and out of the place had to go by there. And I saw that he was getting interviews with a bunch of our best and most wonderful people, including Catherine and Roger Strittmatter and Don Rubin. So, he had a chance to jump right into the deep end with some of our most foremost speakers and writers. Don Rubin edited the Journal of Scientific Exploration that was published last year, and of course, Roger's been working on the books that oddly end with that have the Earl of Oxford's handwriting confirmed by forensic analysis. So he's looking at the connection between that and some of the Roman tragedies. And so he got to talk about some of that. He's been, of course, our most prolific scholar truly in this world. And, of course, Catherine's so charming and always has a unique point of view and brings forward a whole argument about portraits this time rather than some of her more traditional stuff that's based on literary identity. So, we had an exciting conference. We saw a wonderful production of Hamlet at the Performing Arts Center, directed by Chris Coleman. It was done in a very traditional manner, and it was a very powerful production, a lovely theater. So we were very privileged to have Chris and the actors who were in the play come and join us for a talk the next day. I got to give my paper on Hamlet and the evidence that Mary Queen of Scots, the crises of Mary Queen of Scots represented, had something to do with the timing of an early Hamlet. So I was privileged to give a paper at the same time we had the actor and the director of the show nearby, and we had a great conference and discussion afterwards. Overall, the collegiality was wonderful. We had about 80 people on site and another 40 or 50 who were live streaming the program. There will be available on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship YouTube channel in the weeks ahead selected talks that would be available to the public. We haven't posted any of those talks yet, but usually within a month or two at most of the conference, certainly before the first of the year, we will have some of the more highly regarded talks. And last year we posted actually a dozen or more of the talks that were given at the conference. So look forward to that. I really enjoyed Jonathan Jackson's talk on Shakespeare's spirituality. It was a beautiful talk about how the Eastern Orthodox tradition influenced Shakespeare. So it was like there were some very, very wonderful and serious expressions going on there. And again, these conferences are about collegiality as much as anything else, and we all really had a wonderful, wonderful time together. I was able to complete my duty as a member of the board, and it was my last year of 2 years as president of the fellowship. So I have been relieved of duty, and now I can get back to my own writing and working on concluding some papers I've been working on in recent years. So altogether, it was a great thing, and it was a wonderful occasion to have Chris Jordan there to expand to a larger audience some of the ideas that we share.
And after talking with Catherine after each year's conference, it sounds like attendance goes up a few more people either there and or joining over Zoom or StreamYard, one of the video links that is used, and
right,
absolutely, it's gratifying that people like Chris are getting going there, getting the word out, generating even more interest in this really fascinating topic.
Well, the Shakespeare Authorship Fellowship YouTube channel just hit 1 million views recently, and that's only been around for less than a decade. Okay, so we recently got, and there are conference videos there. There are other interviews that are posted there. There's Blue Boar sessions that are posted up there. There will be Shakespeare Illuminated sessions that will get posted up there. So yes, the recording of video content and the interviews and the spreading of word by the web has been a phenomenal in growing interest in the subject and leading people to exploring it online, and then maybe getting smart enough and curious enough to go out and buy an actual book that might help deepen their interest in this real deep mystery. I mean, to me, it's the most wonderful exploration. I've known about this question for 40 years, but I've only spent really the last 20 digging in since I retired from being a doc and could focus on reading Shakespeare and criticism and what my colleagues are all writing, which is pretty prodigious ultimately. And I find that I have a consistent feeling that I'm really on a true path here, that there's a mystery around who wrote these works. We have our solution, but we can't confirm by any definitive smoking gun content, but we're getting closer. So to be on the forefront of such a radical departure from traditional views on where our most illustrious playwright of our language was identified and where he came from and who he was and what his attitudes were toward poetry and literature and his relationships, it's a marvelous thing. It's a never-ending story, really, and I think your listeners would really get excited if they found out that how much was really going on here. And I would highly recommend the most recent publication on this is Elizabeth Winkler's book, published by Harper's last year. Not Harper's, excuse me. I can't remember her publisher's name. Anyway, Shakespeare Was a Woman and Other Heresies, How Doubting the Bar Became the Biggest Taboo in Literature. And it's available as an audiobook as well as in paperback on Amazon or other booksellers. And it's a wonderful look at the history of it. She's a journalist without a bone to pick about any particular candidate who was piqued into writing this book out of criticism she received for suggesting that Amelia Lanier, a rather famous Elizabethan poet, may have been behind writing some of the works of Shakespeare or an inspiration for some of that work. And the heat she took in criticism encouraged her into writing this marvelous book that I think really speaks to leaves the reader to draw their own conclusions, because she's a journalist and she does not pass judgment on anything, but she just presents the evidence as she sees it and hears it and reads it. And she's a wonderful writer in that regard. And then, of course, the first modern book that really got the ball rolling is Shakespeare by Another Name by Margot Anderson, which, was a wonderful book back in 2005, so 20 years almost ago, which was updating of Charlton Ogren's 1984 book, The Mysterious William Shakespeare. So we've had a series of books that the lineage goes back to the mid-'80s, which is when I got interested in this. And there's been spin-offs, the Frontline program by Al Austin based on Ogburn's book is a marvelous entry for many people. Many people got turned on by that video, which was the most popular Frontline program ever broadcast on PBS. I think you could still get it available online in some pirated editions. But the interest has grown and grown and grown and become more and more capable of creating literature that coherently gives a story that's an alternative to the traditional attribution. So it's an exciting time for those of us that are willing to dig a little bit deeper into this, who have a love of Shakespeare.
Okay. At the beginning of what you were just covering, you mentioned that you're a doctor.
Yes.
And okay, so the real author was pretty accurate about medical conditions.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Maybe
in King Lear you're dealing with Alzheimer's. You have herbal remedies in Midsummer Night's Dream. The author must have had some kind of medical training.
You've got it. You hit the nail on the head. I mean, this is the conclusion, but by every doctor that's written about Shakespeare is they're astonished by the medical knowledge that's reflected in the works, that it suggests a knowledge of the practices of the day, both Paracelsian and Galenic medicine represented, and deep dive into certain diseases and conditions, and a very positive attitude toward physicians in general. Most of the physicians represented on the stage at that time were mocked for their incompetence because they were using a model that was, useless and 2,000 years old, and they just never wanted to give it up for another, 100 years or so, the Galenic ideas that drove the medicine practice. And so, but Shakespeare had a very positive attitude toward physicians in general, and doctors writing about him have published a whole number of books going back to John Charles Bucknell's book published over 150 years ago, which he wrote in response to Lord Campbell's book, Shakespeare's Legal Acquirement. That was published in 1859, and then in 1860, Shakespeare's Medical Knowledge was published by John Charles Bucknell, who was the director of a psychiatric hospital in Devon. And it's brilliant. It really covers Shakespeare's hundreds of medical allusions throughout the canon. So he really set the mark high in a couple 100-page book, and then other physicians have kind of picked it up along the way. And just in terms of the reverence that Shakespeare had for the miracle qualities that some physicians have, nobody stands taller than Lord Cerimon and Pericles. And most people don't ever get to see that play, but his reflection on it shows a deep knowledge of medicine and a high ethical component, that he was familiar with the Hippocratic corpus. He was familiar with the Hippocratic oath, with the Asclepian tradition, with Galen and Paracelsus. All the people that were, he was aware of the conflict between the Galens and the Paracelsians in the medical community. And so, and if you're the Earl of Oxford in this mix, you're right there, because George Baker, the Queen's surgeon, is also your surgeon and dedicates 2 books to you and a book to your wife as well. And you also receive a dedication from John Hester, who was the foremost apothecary in London at that time, who was translating the Paracelsian text. And so Oxford was surrounded by people. His wife was an acknowledged empiric practitioner, healing people within their neighborhood. She was medically trained. So he's an ideal candidate when it comes to considering where did Shakespeare get his medical knowledge. The libraries in which he grew up had copious medical texts in them. Burghley had over 200 medical texts in his huge library that Oxford lived almost a decade at Cecil House. And he was in wardship and then married Anne Cecil, Burghley's daughter. So it's truly that he was part of the people that were looking at the most revolutionary aspects of medicine and the conflict of theories about it and studying it and knowing about herbs. And, of course, the botanical knowledge that Shakespeare exudes is just phenomenal. Also, hundreds of plants and trees identified in the most poetic forms. Garrett Queeley's fine book on Shakespeare's flowers is just an astonishing show of knowledge of these areas. But there's one speech I had written down here to recite, since I knew that you were going to bring up this question in medicine, and it's from Lord Cerimon, and it's considered perhaps the highest form of description of the medical practice in the Renaissance era by some of the scholars writing about Shakespeare and his and Renaissance medicine. David Henniger made said that there's no other speech like this devoted to medical art and the whole range of Elizabethan or Jacobean art. He exemplifies the Hippocratic ideal of medicine. And so here's that speech. And this is right before he resuscitates Queen Thaisa from apparent death. She's died while aboard a ship. They've cast her coffin off the ship which they sealed. It lands up following a tsunami wave and an earthquake up on the beach, and they bring the casket. They open it up, and there's the queen presumed to be dead. And then he resuscitates her. He reheats her. He treats her for her hypothermia, and they play music, and he uses his magic potions and brings her back to life. It's a miraculous recovery. It's almost as beautiful as the statue scene of the Winter's Tale. It has that same sacred spiritual realization in his most elevated time. But here's his speech. I'll stop there. I hold it ever, virtue and cunning were endowments greater than nobleness and riches. Careless heirs may the two latter darken and expend, but immortality attends the former, making the man a god. 'Tis known, I ever have studied physic, through which secret art, by turning o'er authorities, I have, together with my practice, made familiar to me and my aid the blessed infusions that dwell in vegetatives, in metals, stones, and can speak of the disturbances that nature works, and of her cures, which doth give me a more content in course of true delight than to be thirsty after tottering honor, or tie my pleasure up in silken bags to please the fool in death. I mean, that speech alone is enough to give me chills.
Mm-hmm.
His expression of, he knew from literature, he knew from practice, and his knowledge was based on a sacred calling. And I think there was Shakespeare expresses that perfectly in that passage. And the other person who, of course, provides the miraculous cures in Shakespeare from the medical standpoint is Helena, and All's Well That Ends Well, who cures the king's fistula miraculously, and then, of course, gains Bertram's hand, which he must resist. Measure for Measures, not Measure for All's Well That Ends Well, probably one of the most painfully autobiographical novels, plays if you're an Oxfordian, because of the fact that Helena would be a marker for his wife Anne Cecil, who was an empiric practitioner and knew of these sacred rites. So it's a beautiful story, and the medicine part of it was something that really lit me up. I didn't get into this until I was asked to give a talk to a group of ER docs on medical knowledge, and I went to the library and I realized, oh my gosh, there's so much here that really expresses the reverence that Shakespeare had for physicians. And one of the more recent publications by a British physician, Kenneth Heaton, looked at Shakespeare's psychophysiological descriptions. He actually describes or portrays 10 deaths by great supreme emotion, grief or joy. Death will come. 20 episodes of fainting from emotional distress. He was deeply interested in and descriptive of the neurological phenomenon. He describes Caesar's generalized grand mal seizure perfectly, so there's so much there. It's got forensic descriptions that are something like from a CSI investigation. To me, it just delights to look at the way that he weaves in medical content into the plays. He has Falstaff give a great soliloquy on the benefit of sherry sec and its physiological effects on the body, which is following an exact Galenic formula. So even in his most comical characters, he puts the voice of wisdom when it comes to medicine occasionally. So it was really a pleasure to prepare a talk, and then I wrote a paper on this, which people could access if they were interested. And I found that to be a place where I could really appreciate it because of my own experience in medicine.
Okay, well, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, there is the use of, drops
yes.
from a pansy.
Yes.
Yeah, yes. And antidotes. I don't know that kind of. I can identify the flowers, but the nutritional values I don't know anything about. But there is that scene in the plays with the herbal, like topographical cream or something like that. But when you look at the 16th century use of herbs and flowers, we'll probably get into echinacea today. They're kind of using. The author is using concepts that preceded, the today's pharmaceutical industry.
Well, yes. I mean, And the fascination with it, particularly since the Paracelsons were bringing a whole different distillation process into the mix and metals into the mix. And of course, they were using mercury, of course, to treat syphilis. So there were things that were quite toxic that might have been effective against some of these diseases that they had. But there is the description of the cursed Hibonin that gets poured into King Hamlet's ears by his brother Claudius that causes his death. That gives a great description of the effect of the Hibonin. And henbane, which is the herb you're talking about here, is known to cause hallucinations. Is not a mortal drug, generally speaking, would not be absorbed through the ear in a mortal. So that's a bit of a fantasy, but there's no question that henbane in proper concentration can cause hallucinations and other medical disturbances, but usually not an actual death, in that. But he does mention the cursed henbane, and of course the love, drops that he takes from the purple flower. That Cupid's arrow pierces the flower, and now it turned purple, and he squeezes the juice of that into Titania's eyes and causes her to fall in love with the first creature that comes by. And of course, the transformed bottom that comes by with his ass's head, and then you have this launch of this whole hysterical romance between the Queen of the Fairies and a monster, which very interestingly had a political allegory written into it that's been recognized by a handful of scholars, but you won't find too much mention of this in any traditional interpretation of Midsummer Dream. And to be quite just brief with the summary, Titania is a stand-in for Queen Elizabeth, and Bottom is a stand-in for the Duc d'Alençon, also known as the Duc d'Anjou, who was her last suitor. And it's in the 1579-1580 range that their negotiation for the marriage contract was going on. Well, his Ambassador Jean Simier, was known to have love potions that he was feeding the Queen. And they actually tried to kill him. I mean, Earl of Leicester and Christopher Hatton put out a contract on him a couple different times, and one time they shot at him, but he was too close to the Queen and really caused an outrage at that time at Simier. So Simier brought apparently some kind of love potion from France that, according to Martin Hume, made the Queen look bonny younger by 15 years. And both Alençon and Simier were known to go to be visited by her in their bedchamber unchaperoned. So she's hanging out with these French suitors who are using a love potion. And Shakespeare, 10 years later, is writing a comedy that mocks the whole story of Elizabeth's fascination with the French Duke. And in the end, he failed in his suit to marry her. She sends him off to Flanders to fight the Spanish there. He fails and goes back and dies of a broken heart at the age of 28. And the whole story of Bottom is playing Hercule de Valois, or Francois Hercule de Valois. He says, I could play Hercules really, or Parc de Terre Cat. He's announcing to the audience that he's playing that French Duke whose birth name was Hercules. And there's numerous contacts between Bottom and Hercule and Titania and Queen Elizabeth within that place. So the writer is not only taking advantage of an intoxicating love potion mixture that was famous at court and really quite scandalous. Apparently, and apparently Elizabeth was playing the Duke all along, according to most historians. And in the end, it was realized by everybody that it was a complete farce, that it was a tactic to delay the French from making an alliance with the Spanish during that critical time when, Mary Queen of Scots was still actively involved in trying to usurp her, and the Spanish threat was there, and an alliance between France and Spain would have been disastrous to the English. So this is real politic, going on here, but it was captured humorously by Shakespeare a decade later when it was first performed during one of those wedding ceremonies. Some people suggest it was the Earl of Derby and the Earl of Oxford's eldest daughter, Elizabeth Vere's wedding, that it might have been first performed for. There are other noble weddings during the mid-1590s that have been suggested as venues for this play, which you could call an epithalamium, a poem for marriage, because everybody gets married in the end. It all works out famously, So it's a wonderful a study both of the effects of herbs, but most fascinatingly, the idea that Shakespeare could mock the Queen in a play while she was still alive in a way so deliciously funny. that he could get away with it. Where does Shakespeare consider getting that kind of artistic license coming from from Stratford-upon-Avon? He does not have that authority, and he would have his hand cut off if he had done that. But the Earl of Oxford is one of the Queen's, favorites. He could do that. So.
Okay. So I'm sure that there are a lot of people in the audience, just like me, just realizing if Edward de Vere is, satirizing the Queen and the, what was his name, Valois. He could get away with it, but the country bumpkin from Stratford couldn't do that. No.
Well, you can say that any play that shows a tendency to mock a member of Elizabeth's court, and there are a number of them you could identify from an Oxfordian standpoint, of course, not generally from a traditional standpoint. Whether it's Hamlet or Love's Labour's Lost, or there are a number of other plays that seem to have parallels with Oxford's life, like All's Well That Ends Well. It's very, very close to the actual facts. In fact, I think it's Ted Hughes who says that of all the plays of Shakespeare, it looks to me like All's Well That Ends Well is the closest thing to an apology for the wife that he left back in Stratford. Well, the Earl of Oxford had the same kind of experience where he left a wife for 5 years after when he got back from Europe. So they were separated for 6.5, almost 7 years after they were married, because and he denied the paternity of their first daughter, Elizabeth Vere. But he went off to Italy, just like Bertram does. And he did not perhaps want to marry Anne Cecil, or at some point was drawn to avoid her for a number of years without an adequate explanation for why their separation. They eventually got back together in the early 1580s after he was restored to court. Excuse me. Choking on my tea. But the parallels to his life in a number of the plays, including Hamlet, are quite remarkable.
Okay. That's just a really fascinating subject. So, while we're talking about the political expediency of the Queen possibly getting married, you do delve into other political intrigues in your chapter in the contested year about the interpretation of the gunpowder plot in Macbeth. Okay, you're talking about the Catholic radicals at that time. Let's get into a little bit of that topic.
There was a gunpowder plot, and it actually did result in an explosion, and it was at Kirkle Field outside of Edinburgh Castle in 1567. That was part of the assassination attempt of Lord Darnley, who was Mary Queen of Scots' husband, King of Scotland after all, he was recovering from a skin disease that might have been syphilis, it might have been smallpox, it might have been due to a poisoning. There's been various representations of what it might be by various scholars, but he was separated from Mary for a period of time. And they were getting back together. She had visited him there earlier in the evening, and then she goes back to the castle to attend a wedding ceremony, and somewhere in the middle of the night, the house blows up because there's been gunpowder buried in the lower chamber, and it exploded and destroyed the building that he was on the first floor in his quarters. He apparently had been warned because he must have gotten out of the building. There was a window, and a chair was below the window where he and one of his servants escaped, and they got over a wall into an orchard adjacent to the Kirkhope field. But he was found strangled there. He was suffocated there, and was found. Both of them were found on the ground there. And of course, that resulted in a major crisis, of course, in Scotland, where the king had been assassinated and separated from his wife, and eventually she was accused of colluding with the Earl of Bothwell, who was the sheriff of Edinburgh, and was probably behind the plot in the end. And, of course, she marries Bothwell a couple months later after that, and then within a month of that, she's defeated at Carberry Hill, deposed, and Bothwell runs off to Norway, where he's arrested and spends 10 years in jail. But there was a gunpowder plot that did change the crown in Scotland, but there was an explosion, but it's not the one that the scholars are claiming are being referred to in the apparent 16th century or 17th century so-called Macbeth. So I think that if Shakespeare was writing about a gunpowder plot, it was part of the story that you see behind Macbeth and Hamlet, because there's a lot of parallels in Hamlet to the whole Mary Queen of Scots story. And that's actually what I was talking about at the Denver conference. And a number of scholars, including David Bevington and Murray Axton and a few others who have written commendably about this, is that the earliest version of Hamlet we have is from 1589. And many scholars say, well, Shakespeare wasn't in London at that time. He couldn't have written that. That's an Hamlet. Maybe, Thomas, they make up a story to try to explain it. But there was productions of Hamlet in the early 1590s documented, and so there was an early Hamlet years before it was thought to have been written and performed in the early 17th century. And in 1589, there was a reference to whole Hamlets and handfuls of tragical speeches. So you know that there was that. That would have been topical of the execution of Mary Queen of Scots in 1587, and then in 1588, the Spanish Armada is launched, and in that summer in 88, they're finally defeated. It was the beginning of a 15-year war with Spain, actually. There was many more armadas that were launched, but all failed. So the condition of Mary Queen of Scots and the fact that her assassination her execution for treason was connected in some way to the launch of war with Spain. And so it was a big topic, a big subject. And you think about the Earl of Oxford, he gets his annuity from Queen Elizabeth in 1586 in June, and by October of that year, he's called up to Fotheringay Castle, where he sits with the other 30-some lords. He was the highest-ranking nobleman at the trial, commissioner at the treason trial of Mary Queen of Scots, who was convicted, and then finally Elizabeth signed her death warrant about 4 months later, and she was executed, I think, in March of 1587. So it all ties together in some way that maybe writing an early Hamlet and including political allusions to the Mary Queen of Scots, melodrama in which she married the man who murdered the king, her husband, and looking at the historical and literary parallels in those passages really light you up, because you think now Shakespeare's written a play about the deposition and the justifiable regicide that of the killing of a monarch is a big deal, and so you have to be a pretty horrible person like Claudius to justify in the end. So the parallels to historical document, combining with the literary source of Belforet or Saxo Grammaticus' story of Amleth, is a remarkable integration of both the topical historical context of that time with an ancient story taken from a collection, from a French collection, Histoire tragique, translated by François Belforet and published just a few years earlier. So it was part of a political campaign. And don't doubt that the history plays were all part of a political campaign, justify the Tudor realm. You can look at Richard III, and you see an obvious demon made by Holinshead and Shakespeare, colluding to make Richard look like a horrible, demonically inspired, king who's going to murder all his family, and colluding the princes.
Yeah,
and finally be defeated by
tower.
who? Elizabeth's grandfather, okay? So this may have been a time in which the Earl of Oxford was actually beginning his career as a court dramatist and being paid his £1,000 annuity to help provide court entertainments that supported the Tudor cause. So when you tie the history together with the plays in a way that Oxfordians can, because of the position their man is in, very involved in the Mary Queen of Scots story, it's a remarkable awakening that you can go through and say, wow, he was writing stuff that was historically relevant and that most scholars don't recognize. You won't find much of a mention of this in any edition of Hamlet.
Okay, so when you and Catherine, Alex McNeil, have been guests, we've it always gets to the point where there is a reference to the need to redate the plays as being about a generation earlier than what our English high school English teachers have told us. So with the examples from just say the gunpowder plot from Macbeth, you're giving us going back to an event from 1567, not
right.
1605.
Very different, yes. Well, anybody that thinks that producing Macbeth before the king would please him is crazy, because the sinister quality, the dark images of the supernatural would have been extremely disturbing to King James. I mean, he was obsessed with witchcraft, and many witches were burned during his stand, during his realm. And he even wrote a book about the supernatural. So he had distinct fears. I don't think he was the kind of person that would have appreciated the kind of power given to the supernatural. Even though he is a descendant of Banquo in the end, so this is a tip of the hat to the Stuart line in some small way, but that play would not have been a pleasant experience for the King James to observe. It'd be my opinion about it. I mean, many people say, "Oh, he wrote that," and then of course the whole question of the word equivocation that the Porter uses. Well, that was a big word during the trial of Campion back in 1580 that was reported by Anthony Munday, who was one of our Oxford secretaries during that time. So if the word equivocation means anything, it comes from a source in the 1580s when it was originally used as a defense for Edmund Campion, unsuccessfully so, who was tried and convicted. But he equivocated, and so that word has been in the popular vernacular for 25 years before it becomes something that people latch onto and say, "Oh, this is why Shakespeare used this word, this unique word." No, it had been around for quite a long time before it was used like that in Macbeth. So I think the early dating, the plays is the biggest challenge that will ultimately help unseat the traditional view. Kevin Gilvary edited a book called Dating Shakespeare's Plays. Just write that down. So you Google Dating Shakespeare's Plays UK for United Kingdom, and you will be drawn to the De Vere Society online publication of the best reference there is on the criteria used to date the plays. And believe me, there is no solid evidence for when any of the plays were actually written. Yes, we know that they might have been performed because they're in somebody's, diary or the court records. In fact, there's more records of Shakespeare plays being performed at court than in the public theaters, actually. So his plays were very popular, and the year Oxford died, 7 of his plays were performed at court during that Revel season. So, so we have the names of plays and productions going on there, and then you have the quarto editions starting in 1593, and in the first 5 years the quartos are published, there's no name attached to them. There's no author attached to any of those first quartos of the Henry VI plays and Titus Andronicus and the other plays. No author is mentioned. And then finally in 1598, when Francis Mears publishes his book, which lists 12 plays that Shakespeare wrote, and he'd written more because there's many that were already known to exist that Mears does not mention. but he mentions 12 because that's the number he wants. 12 history plays or tragedies and 12 comedies. I mean, 6 of each. It was part of his balanced system. So only then do you see the name appear on the quarto editions. So, and there's numerous quartos that come out, but we don't know when they were actually written. There's a reference to Timon in 1584 to an Athenian misanthropos biting on the stage, and that's clearly a Timon play. And if you're an Oxfordian, well, that fits your time frame very well. And so you look at for the circumstances of Earl of Oxford's life in 1584, and they were Timonesque. He was losing everything. He had sold all of his estates virtually by that point, and had just recovered from spending, 2 years exiled from the court, and unable to support the 2 acting companies and the acrobats and musicians he was doing for more than a few more years. So he was stressed and pressed all through the latter part of the 80s, and then in 86, of course, he starts getting the £1,000 annuity that helps sustain his household, which is much diminished by that point. So that fits with the Timon early dating reference. So, but you don't see that in every edition. You don't see 1584 date. Timon knows 1608, 1610, something like that. So it's curious. And then, so you have Kevin Gilvary edited Dating Shakespeare's Plays, UK. Go look online, and you will see the criteria by which the dating of the plays is established and how they conflict. That if you're looking at stylistic criteria, it conflicts with the dating criteria based on literary allusions or letters that were written that reference a play. So it's a mystery about when the plays were actually written. And when you consider that 18, virtually half the canon, had never been published during Shakespeare's lifetime, that they all turned up in the first folio, published in 1623, 7 years after his death. So where were these manuscripts? What were they doing? There's fantasies about that have been written and produced, and plays have been written try to solve that mystery. But I think the people to whom it was dedicated, the incomparable brothers, the Earl of Pembroke and the Earl of Montgomery, the Sidney, the Mary Sidney sons, were the dedicatees. One of them was married, of course, to Susan Vere, and the other one was once engaged to Bridget Vere, one of the sisters. So there was a deep family connection to the folio, and Ben Jonson was, of course, the guy that kind of pulled that folio together. Catherine's written very well about that. And Ben Jonson dedicated works to Susan Vere and to the Pembrokes and the Montgomerys. He was very close to them, and the Earl of Pembroke was the Lord Chamberlain, and so they had control of what was being published. They had control of what was being put on in the theater, and there were the family members and the aristocracy that were responsible for not only publishing the works of Shakespeare, but concealing the attribution for whatever reason people might want to come to. There's a variety of reasons why we could talk about that for the another 2 hours about what was the motive of the author to hide his identity in all this. But it may have been, as much as anything, a family decision that was posthumously made by the families because they wanted to avoid the embarrassment of having a nobleman writing about the scourge of syphilis in Timon of Athens or Troilus and Cressida, I mean, I think there's reasons why Oxford hid his identity, and among them is the fact that he was writing what amounted to, in some regards, state-sponsored Tudor propaganda. And so, you have a variety of reasons why these plays might be subversive in one way or supportive in other ways of the Elizabethan, enterprise. It gets very interesting, and there's so much I learn almost every day as I read about this more, and then really looking back at some of the things that I've read, I said, oh yeah, I forgot about that one. That's a good connection, because it does tie together in a beautiful web or a mosaic, I would call, that we each have a piece of the puzzle. You're putting it together, and maybe in our lifetime there'll be a definitive solution, Mark. I would bet on our guy, the Earl of Oxford, far greater than any other candidate that's put forward, and especially ahead of the claims of the traditional attribution that has been in existence for the last 400 years. We're beyond that now. We're post-Stratfordian in our perspective on this, and I think that is a healthy, open-minded, and it encourages critical thinking. That's the thing that this whole enterprise will stimulate critical thinking, because you have to think outside the box. You can't accept the conclusions of the experts, because in some ways they are practicing sins of omission. They don't recognize that the fact that Earl of Oxford was very, very closely connected to what was going on in the theater culture at that time, because they're embarrassed by the claim that Oxford was a better candidate than Shakespeare. And the big work that I've done over the past couple decades is to look at Greek sources in Shakespeare, Greek dramatic sources from the Greek plays, lost for 2,000 years and then reinvented through Shakespeare for the first time. And I think that is one of the things that made me so excited about this work, is that I could see where Shakespeare was employing Greek sources, and I found scholars who were thinking 100 years ago about this that wrote commendably well about all the manifestations of parallels between the story of Aeschylus's Oresteia and Hamlet and Macbeth. That's also an imprint on them, that Shakespeare would incorporate elements and imagery and dramaturgy from the ancient Greek sources was a radical idea, because these plays had never been translated into English, let alone published in England, even in Latin editions. They were in the private libraries, the ones that the Earl of Oxford had access to. And, of course, he was deeply invested in studying Greek literature. At 19, he bought Plato in folio, and he had the French edition of Plutarch's Lives, and the Heliodorus, the great Greek romance novel, the Aethiopica, the translation by Thomas Underdown. That was dedicated to the Earl of Oxford, and that was the foundational work for a lot of Elizabethan comedy. So he was deeply immersed in the middle of this, and I think the fact that he's such a good candidate, if you're looking at using Greek sources, it's an embarrassment to the traditional attribution, and people draw back from acknowledging that, except for one or two modern authors. Probably the most credible modern author writing about Shakespeare and the Greeks is a professor at Brooklyn College, Tanya Pollard. Her book it was an award-winning book, and it's the Greek tragic on Shakespearean, on Elizabethan stages. And she covers the fact that Shakespeare was deeply inspired by Euripides' plays about Iphigenia at Aulis and Hecuba and the Alcestis. All those plays of Euripides influenced Shakespeare's work in a number of his plays, especially the Alcestis, particularly in the concluding scenes of Much Ado and The Winter's Tale. The magical statue scene of The Winter's Tale is based on Euripides' tragicomedy, in which the queen is brought back from her grave after Hercules wrestles her from death and presents her to the king veiled, just like Hero goes back to Claudio in Much Ado. And so you recognize that this dramaturgy is straight out of a Greek source. And so that kind of electrifies you. You realize that your author, that something that Jonathan Bate won't admit, or some great Shakespeare scholars are very uncomfortable with, because there might not have been a published edition of the Alcestis in England during Shakespeare's lifetime. So you have literary sources. That is actually among the foundational doubts about the traditional stories, that how did he gain access to the hundreds of texts? Had that been identified by scholars over the hundreds of years of the investigation? How did he get access to those hundreds of books, and so many of them in untranslated editions of Italian, French, Spanish maybe, and in my view, definitely Greek. And so the mystery deepens when you start looking at literary sources, and then that is the foundation so much of why scholars initially began questioning the traditional attribution. They just couldn't believe that a man could write this stuff without having access to a great library. And of course, there were no public libraries back in the day, and there's no record of Shakespeare ever owning a book. So that was never going to be a question that could be answered by the traditional narrative. And so you have gaping the vertiginous distance, as Sam Schoenbaum, between the sublimity of the work and the prosaic and consequence of the life. That's a great Shakespeare scholar affiliated with the Folger Shakespeare Library, admitting that there's a vertiginous distance between what we know of Shakespeare's life, the biography, and what you could call biographiction, because most of it's made up. You can't talk about much about Shakespeare because you don't have any letters, you don't have any books, you don't have any personal testimonials. You have the 6 signatures, and you have records of sales of property and purchases of property and hoarding grain and lawsuits and, tax evasion and other prosaic things, but nothing that's of a literary nature that directly connects to the man. Until you see the 1623 monument erected at Holy Trinity Church, and now the fantasy has begun. So, it's that question that drove Mark Twain crazy and Walt Whitman crazy. Whitman said he didn't know who wrote it, but he said it must have been one of those wolfish earls that wrote it, and he was spot on. And this is not about status and thinking that you had to be a nobleman to write works like this. No, I mean, Ben Jonson was a commoner, and he wrote commendably well. There were, knights like Philip Sidney that wrote very well. But there were also noblemen that wrote very well, that were great poets of that time, and that was part of their tradition, was to circulate poetry in manuscript form. In fact, that's all Sidney did. He never published any of his work. Everything that he ever wrote was published posthumously by his sister Mary. So, there was an interiorized culture of sharing literature that was hand transcribed and circulated in manuscript. So it was a very different culture from our own. And I do believe that there was a very small number of people that were in on the deal. They were mostly members of the family or part of the patronage circle within that family that were able to successfully conceal the authorship and later on move it towards Stratford-upon-Avon and erect a little monument there and put in the Stratford Monument, mention it in the first folio, and suddenly 100 years later you got tourism being birthed in Stratford, and now you got $1 billion industry running the place down there, the Birthplace Trust. Maybe not $1 billion, but it is the number 2 tourist destination in England besides London. So it has a massive Walt Disney style thing at Stratford-upon-Avon. It's quite remarkable. You really feel like you're in a fantasy land there when you're walking around, because it's all been restoration building, and none of the buildings that the Birthplace Trust came that belonged to Shakespeare or where his wife was born, or Anne Hathaway's cottage and Mary the Arden College and the Dr. Hall's Croft, that's where the daughter married the doctor to live there. All of that's made up. There's no documentary evidence that any of the buildings, including the Birthplace Trust itself, was where Shakespeare lived or was born. Yes, he lived there, but it's been Disneyfied. And they sell a fantasy. The one reason to go to Stratford, to see a play at the Royal Shakespeare Company Theatre there. It's a gorgeous theatre, well worth a trip from London to get out there to see some things. But realize, if you're visiting Stratford, it's fantasy land. There's a mythopoetic drive to try to know the author, and they've created quite a fantasy. And they have almost nothing to say about the life of the man. Like at the Folger Shakespeare Library, the remodeled library, they have almost nothing about Shakespeare biography in their public display cases. They show the several hundred folios they own in a big display, but they don't talk about the author's life hardly at all in trying to explain how all this work came together. So there's a lot going on, and if you're willing to pick up the sheets and look under the sheets, read a book, go to the website of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, and you will find a great deal of useful information there. Alex McNeil did a fabulous 30-minute Shakespeare 101 lecture that you can get free on our website, on the ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org website. And in 30 minutes, he nails the case about why we have our doubts and why Oxford is the supreme candidate that has emerged over the last 100 years since J. Thomas Looney's great book, Shakespeare Identified, which really started this whole revolution in 1920. Yeah. Excuse me, Mark.
Okay, that's no problem. And I'm sorry. I think Banquo's ghost unplugged me for a second. I didn't touch anything, and all of a sudden, I got disconnected.
Oh.
But you just mentioned Looney's book, and that's actually a terrific. If you like the shows we've done, with Mark Olshaker and collaborator with John Douglas on the criminal profiling, it's really Looney's book almost seems like a forerunner to modern profiling, and I don't. He writes, his assuming a disguise. Insofar as that mysteriousness is concerned, which we attributed to Shakespeare, it must be admitted that the sudden non-appearance of work from such a pen as that of De Vere's is as mysterious as the subsequent appearance of the Shakespeare poems and dramas. So, it's like, he's making a point, as soon as we don't have any of De Vere's literature, Shakespeare suddenly appears.
Yes. Well, you're right. You're absolutely right. Yeah, it does. There's some poetry that's been published in Roger Strittmatter's collection that's on Brief Chronicles, which you can get on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website. Looks at Oxford's early poetry, and he was revered for his poetry. I mean, some of it's excellent and is Shakespearean in its qualities. But it's not thought to be quite Shakespearean, so it's juvenilia. And some of those poems were actually intended as lyrics for songs to popular tunes of the time. So the quality of what you're writing may change a lot through your lifetime. For God's sake, the sonnets were written somebody who was older and obviously in pain over love, the consequences of love and the difficulties around that. So the appearance of this name at the same time that Oxford's name kind of disappears from any literature is puzzling or intriguing. And of course, if you're a follower of Bob Prechter, he has published books online, Oxford Voices. He's saying that Oxford had more than one allonym, that Shakespeare was just one of his many allonyms, that he makes arguments, and he's presented at our conferences on the question of Robert Greene and Thomas Nash being Oxford, allonyms for the Earl of Oxford, which would be very funny if you're thinking about Hamlet and that 1589 reference to Hamlet, because it was in Robert Greene's euphemistic novel Menaphon. That was the introduction to that was written by Thomas Nash, and it mentions the whole handfuls of tragical speeches in a play with Hamlet in it. So maybe he's having a very clever time in three different identities describing the play that he's recently produced. I don't know. I haven't read Bob's books, but he gives compelling arguments and is available online. It's called Oxford's Voices, and it's quite a prodigious collection of arguments around a wide variety of other potential allonyms that the Earl of Oxford may have claimed. So his life was definitely in writing, and whether you think he restricted himself to just the Shakespeare canon or a more expansive vision that he may have also taken on other identities or used other real writers' names to publish materials that he wanted to get out there, because after all, he was deeply connected to all of these writers. They all dedicated works to him. Greene dedicated his Guidonius to Oxford, and Guidonius is a prodigal son story that has passages that are very much like the certain precepts that you find in Hamlet that were not acknowledged to be Burghley's precepts. So there's a connection there. Then that was the same year that Timon was produced at court. So makes it interesting. Nash is another very interesting character in many regards. And, of course, Anthony Munday was part of that circle. And Abraham Fleming was described as Oxford's amanuensis during the latter 1580s. And he was a major contributor to the second edition of Holinshed's Chronicles, which is the source for Shakespeare's history plays. His secretary was rewriting Holinshed, almost doubling the size of Holinshed, working in collaboration with Arthur Golding, the Earl of Oxford's uncle, who dedicated his Roman history Trogus Pompeius to his 14-year-old nephew. They were all in the same room working on these things together. It was all in the same narrow group of university wits that had deep connections to the Earl of Oxford. Anthony Munday was part of that circle, of course. Thomas Watson dedicated his Hecatopathia to the Earl of Oxford in 1580, and passages from that end up in Much Ado About Nothing. So, the literary connections, the web of connections that Earl of Oxford had within those highly respected and very consequential literary circles was central, and his role has been largely erased by historians and Shakespeare scholars because of the discomfiture over certain aspects of his life that were perhaps less reputable. The fact that he abandoned his wife and his firstborn daughter for the better part of 5 years when he came back for no obvious reasons. He may have suspected her of infidelity. There's historical references to her having used a bed trick to get pregnant by him. And, of course, the bed trick turns up in both All's Well That Ends Well and Measure for Measure in the play. So maybe that historical document has some relevance to how Shakespeare puts it together in two of his problem plays, the bed trick, what's going on here. So I think that there's the historical parallels to the Earl of Oxford, his deep literary connections to many of the writers who had access to the sources or who were writing. Robert Greene, it's his Pandosto that appears to be the source for Shakespeare's Winter's Tale. Only Pandosto is a tragedy, and Shakespeare turns the story into a tragic comedy with the resurrection of Leonte's wife Hermione and the statue scene at the end, which is perhaps the most transformational moment in all of Shakespeare's drama that I ever experienced. The first time I ever saw that play, when you presume this queen's been dead for 16 years, there's been a statue of her created so that when the daughter who was sent into exile as an infant and recovered and brought back and reconciled to her father, who was a horrible, paranoid, jealous person in Act 1, turns out that he's gone through a conversion, and they go to the temple that Paulina creates, and there's the veil, the statue behind a curtain. They pull it back, and it looks so lifelike. And apparently the statue was made by Giulio Romano, a very famous Italian sculptor and painter. Is the only artist mentioned in the entire canon. And he was known as a painting, and that statue would have been painted in lifelike colors. It wouldn't have been a white marble statue, no. It would have been a lifelike representation of the queen. And as she had aged by 16 years, he mentions it. And then she has the music playing, and the Pachelbel Canon in D, which reminds me of your introductory music, reminds me of the Pachelbel Canon in D, was playing, and then she reanimates. She comes back to life, and you realize that she's not been dead. She's been in captivity, hidden by her friend Paulina for all this time, waiting for the daughter to come back to be reconciled to the king. And the entire audience is sobbing, and you realize this is a religious moment. This is a moment of high classical art in which everything is pulled together in the most dramatic and in an exalted way, and you have deep emotion. You realize the theater comes from that religious tradition, which comes from the Greeks. The Dionysia were religious ceremonies. These are very serious, sometimes exalted plays, sometimes incredibly funny and political, but they were an incredible piece of work, and Shakespeare takes the best of that and puts it out there in The Winter's Tale at the end. And you have the same dramaturgy, of course, at the end of Much Ado, where hero is returned, presumed to be dead, and unveiled and restored to Claudio, and everybody's very happy at that point. But The Winter's Tale, that final scene, is the penultimate scene. I think scholars have referred to it as the most transformative moment in all of English literature. And as a drama to be experienced in the theater, that to me was it. That was nothing that compares to the feeling of deliverance and redemption that you get at the end of that play. And you realize that this is sacred art, that playwriting is a sacred art. It's not just political, but it has its qualities that extend humans to the limit of their capacity. And then that one, the capacity for forgiveness and redemption was amazing, and it was like pure gold. You knew that you had really gotten your money's worth that day in the show. So anyway, that's a personal reflection of my own conversion because after that, I had to experience it over and over again. I lived in the neighborhood of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival for the better part of 50 years, and I blame my friends who encouraged me to go there and volunteer as an usher to have ruined my life, because I got deeply involved in studying the theater and all the books you buy and all the tickets you buy and all the travel you do so you can engage in this wonderful mystery, because it is the highest art. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a school teacher, who's a physician, but during COVID she homeschooled the kids. And she said, we started reading the Shakespeare plays, and then we read Taming of the Shrew as our first play. And it took us 3 times through it before we really got it. But the next year, when we got back to Shakespeare, we read 12 of the plays, and it was like reclaiming the language. She had high school students excited enough about Shakespeare that every day they would come in and they would do dramatic readings of the Shakespeare plays just to have the experience of the language. To me, that was like genius. That I'm very glad I got a doctor. That's that cool. Anyway, but there's something magical about the language, and if you get exposed to it, it needs to be experienced aloud. And you don't have to go to a theater there. God, you go online and you can get free views of virtually the entire canon. You have your choices on various YouTubes and other channels. You can. There's so many platforms that have good videos of really excellent productions. And if you want to laugh and laugh and laugh, I do recommend an adaptation of Taming of the Shrew that was performed by Meryl Streep and Raul Julia and filmed by Joseph Papp at the Delacorte Theater in New York. This comes back about 1970 maybe that they did this. It's the title of the 2 separate videos that are available on YouTube are Kiss Me Petruchio. Kiss Me Petruchio. And after you see that, you realize how much fun can be had with Shakespeare. The language doesn't get in the way. The action and the language together make for such a beautiful combination. And those young actors who would go on to such distinguished careers really kicked it up. I laugh and laugh and laugh every time I watch it. Kiss Me Petruchio. But there's at least 3 or 4 versions of Taming of the Shrew that are really good productions. That are available. The BBC has a complete history collection available out there. So if your listeners are interested in Shakespeare and want to have a direct experience of theater, go watch a video. I find them to be actually still quite compelling, and to hear the words and see them acted out convinces me that I'm seeing something of high art and experiencing, even though I don't catch all the nuance. I want to be there. So, yeah.
Wasn't John Cleese in a from Monty Python? He was in BBC.
Yes, he did. He was a great Petruchio. He is hysterical as a Petruchio, and I think it's freely available online. Yeah, I watched that. It was one of the really fun productions. He was great at that. Yeah. And I could go on and on about the various videos that are available out there, but I still think that Mel Gibson's Hamlet, even though it was a very abridged version that combined the first quarto and second quarto stuff, it's compelling, and the way it was put together it's Franco Zeffirelli again doing miraculous things with Shakespeare, and I think it was probably his one of his best Mel Gibson's plays. I mean, he really could play a serious, crazy Hamlet very, very, very well. I thought that was an amazing production. And if you want to excite students about Shakespeare, watch a video and then read the text, because there's something in it that really has an appeal that can grow on you.
Yeah, when I visited Dunnottar Castle, which was used as, exterior shots were used as Hamlet's, main castle. There were still some of the, wooden turrets, the wood used to make, the turrets look like they were still had roofs on them, stuffed in the corners. So that's my connection to Mel Gibson's version. Plus seeing it, but it was neat being at the castle where some of the exterior shots were filmed, and I think the Yorick scene was filmed at the bottom of the steps going up to the castle. So
the cinematography in that one was really, really good. And the cast, of course, an impeccable cast, Derek Jacobi and, everybody else that was in that show was superb. I mean, Zeffirelli really had the touch. And his, of course, Romeo and Juliet is perhaps the most popular ever of all the videos of that particular play. So, there are things to think about and to love in the art and the fact that we have these videos available to us now like never before. Should grow interest in Shakespeare. Unfortunately, university education now does not emphasize humanities so much as the STEM specialties, and Shakespeare is rarely taught at many universities. I was very fortunate. At Southern Oregon University, there was a very strong Shakespeare program. When I retired in 2003, I registered and became a student at Southern Oregon University with the undergraduates, and I took a series of courses there from 3 different instructors. And then I had access to the library there, which was rich in Shakespeare texts because of its affiliation with the Oregon Shakespeare Festival and the scholars who have supported that in creating what's called a Renaissance Institute. So they had like 7,000 Shakespeare-related titles in the library at the college where I was taking classes. So to me, I was set up like very few people to actually be excited and engage in it and have access to a great library where you could look at the original sources, look at commentaries. And my favorite place to look for commentaries on Shakespeare to understand the works best and to see what the literary sources were and what the critics were writing about the various interpretations were the very Aurum editions published from the last part of the 19th century and early 20th century by Howard Horace Furness. And his annotated editions would have, 2/3 of the page would be footnotes and annotations, and then they'd have the full text, of course. And so these were like 500- and 600-page editions. And the appendices included commentaries going back 200 years from when this is a 100-year-old book. So I was being able to read criticism from the 18th and 19th century, in seeing what they saw in the Shakespeare works as part of my study. And I realized that back then people were better trained in the classics and they recognized the affiliation between Shakespeare and Greek drama. The whole statue scene we were talking about earlier, there were scholars writing in the 1870s saying, look at this remarkable parallel between this. He surely was inspired by Euripides' plays. And then around the turn of the century, Robert Root writing Shakespeare in the Classics says, there's no way any of the Greek drama affected his idea of mythology in his writing his plays. So somebody shut down early in the 20th century the exploration of that Greek question. But the better scholars writing that I could find in those very early editions were amazing. In fact, Lord Campbell, the Lord Chancellor of England, who wrote about Shakespeare's legal acquirement, made commentaries about Macbeth and the Oresteia of Aeschylus that were so compelling that he recognized that Shakespeare must have been inspired by the Greek example, that the parallels, and he's writing in the 1860s, about Shakespeare. He could see it. He could see the connection because he knew the Greek drama from his studying, that the classics were taught. And I was fortunate in my college career to have read some of the classics and to have not lost contact with them. And then later in life, I became more interested in Greek literature, and then Shakespeare would draw me back. And so basically, to understand his sources, I had to go back and read the works of Aeschylus and Euripides and Sophocles and see where I could find parallels that were remarkable within Shakespeare. So it gave me a whole lease on life in exploring the classics, including Homer, of course, who influenced Troilus and Cressida, and Plato and other writers of that era. And one of the works that really got to me was the Symposium, Plato's Dialogue of the Symposium, which is a description of a party that occurred like 30 years earlier. It was called Agathon's Feast. And it was a description of all the various forms of love. This is an all-night party, and you're drinking a lot of wine, and there's girls that come in and they're singing and dancing going along. But there's a series of statements about what comprises the greatest features of love. And Alcestis is brought forward as the woman who sacrifices herself for her husband. That's the highest form of love. And then Plato comes in and gives his talk about, or Socrates comes in and gives his message about love and how Diotima taught him. And Aristophanes gives his interpretation. At the end of the night, the very end of the party, as it's described, Aristophanes is sitting with Socrates and Agathon, who won the tragedies competition. And Socrates says, it's been a wonderful party, and congratulations on writing the best tragedies. But, a great playwright should be able to write both comedy and tragedy. And that, to me, the Earl of Oxford at the age of 19 read that. He had a Plato in folio that he had bought. And then Symposium is like the Republic and some of the other most famous and recognized discourses, dialogues within the works. He certainly would have read that, would have known it, and would have thought about it, and would have taken inspiration from it. And maybe the fact that Shakespeare wrote the greatest comedies and the greatest tragedies of that era, or perhaps of any era, was inspired in part by the fact that the young Earl of Oxford was reading this idea about the idea of what love really means in various ways, and how great poets should be able to write both in the tragical vein and in the comic vein, unlike any, and how they all came about is a beautiful and deep mystery. But I do know that the Greek example was preeminent in the creator's imagination, and the Earl of Oxford certainly fits that profile. And finally, Mark, I should mention the research at Audley End Library in England that Roger Strittmatter has been engaged in for the past 3 years, looking at annotated editions, Greek editions, that were handwritten notes in the columns, in these wide columns intended for annotations. It was a Cassius Dio's History of Rome that is an obvious source, according to Roger's work, for both passages from Antony and Cleopatra and for passages from Julius Caesar. So the great Roman tragedies that Shakespeare wrote, I don't think he mentions Coriolanus among those, but just those two plays had a clear connection to passages that were annotated in the Greek edition of Cassius Dio at Audley End in the handwriting of the Earl of Oxford, 17th Earl of Oxford, that have been confirmed by forensic handwriting specialists. He's published this in a forensic handwriting journal just very recently. And so our guy could annotate in Latin and Greek characters a Greek history of the Roman Republic, the Roman history. And so to me, it's like that closes the deal on the Earl of Oxford as the author of the works, because now we have confirming proof. If Roger's research is confirmed, and he'll be at this for years to come, I'm sure, and he'll be a wonderful guest for Nightlight. Like if you could get into him, and he can go into this a little bit with you, because he's our guy when it comes to breaking the code and identifying the Earl of Oxford through his handwriting. He did the study of the Geneva Bible 20 years ago at the Folger Library. That was Oxford's Bible, and found hundreds of new biblical passages that were underlined or indicated with manicules in that edition that turn up in Shakespeare, added to the biblical allusions within Shakespeare simply because they paralleled passages that had been highlighted in Oxford's personal Bible. So, he's our guy doing the cutting edge stuff that has a literary source work that ties the Earl of Oxford directly through his knowledge of the classical languages in their original form to the works of Shakespeare. It's a miraculous time for me to be part of this, to realize that Roger has gone deeper into this and confirms everything I've been looking at for the last 20 years. And I've looked at Hamlet, Macbeth, Timon of Athens, Titus Andronicus, Much Ado About Nothing, Winter's Tale, Pericles, Midsummer Night's Dream, and found deep roots within the Greek tradition in all those plays that I've had occasion to study and to publish papers on. So it is a ongoing area of fascination for me, and every day the possibility of new revelations resides out there. So in terms of the experience of mystery and magic and something that is so subversive to a traditional, deeply immersed orthodoxy, it's as rich as it gets, and it's a conspiracy of the intelligentsia against those who would defend it, without looking at what we're doing. They don't read our literature. They're afraid of of it, because it would be discomforting to them and would make much of the work that they have done in their own lives irrelevant if they certainly were dealing with Shakespearean biography and trying to explain the works based on the limited evidence we have of connecting him to the plays and poems.
Okay. Since we've mentioned a little bit about traveling. I think what Audley End is that a castle?
It's an estate in Essex.
Some manor house.
It's a manor house. Yes, it's in Essex. It's a manor
Okay.
house, and not far from where the Oxford holdings are in Essex. How those books came, there were several annotated editions that Rogers looked into there, besides the Cassius Dio. But there was a close. These were part of the library of Henry Neville, who was connected at court. He was one of the people prosecuted at the time of the Essex Rebellion. He did not lose his life and went back to court afterwards. And we don't know that he was a playwright, but the original people who were believers that Henry Neville was a candidate for Shakespeare are the people that began looking into this, and I argued that the handwriting looked like Neville's handwriting. Well, Rogers proven in published publication that the handwriting is not Neville's. And Neville did annotate it, but in a very different scribe than the ones that in the Cassius Dio that are consistently. And there are Roger says over 1,000 annotations in the columns. The columns were wide, 2-inch wide columns, built so that a reader could write commentaries and notes. And the commentaries and notes were written in Latin and Greek. About 90% were Latin, about 10%, according to Roger, were annotated in Greek characters. So if in fact those are the Earl of Oxford's writings in a Greek edition of Roman history that has allusions that tie in with poetic imagery and narratives that come out of the Roman tragedies, you've really got something. And it's a place where Oxfordians like Roger will be digging for years to come. And I've known Roger for over 20 years, and what he's created and produced is astonishing. And I have great admiration for the highest quality of scholarship and honesty in scholarship, and it goes way over my head when I read what some of these people are writing. I'm a commoner. I'm a journalist. I'm not a scholar. I'm a person who collects commentaries for other people and tries to put a credible sequence together that ties the ideas and creates a tapestry of knowledge that can be followed and be not necessarily definitive, but supportive. Could be defended in a PhD thesis, perhaps. I don't know. I'm not going that direction, not at this point in my life. But there's ongoing active research going on. The Alexander Waugh has had 1 million hits on the video series he created that is available through the De Vere Society in Great Britain. If you just Google De Vere Society, you'll see they have a whole series of videos that, and Alexander did 50 different videos on various topics related to the whole authorship question. Some of them quite arcane, some of them quite direct and quite marvelous. And he just passed away last year, a great loss to the movement. I know that we've talked about him in the past. And but his video content has hit over 1 million hits also. So there's a popular thirst out there to know things. And if you're interested in the work of people like John Dee and Shakespeare and their connection, Alexander's the man. You can go look at what he's got there, and it's quite amazing. He goes off on some tangents that I find very hard to follow myself personally, but he was the absolute most sincere and dedicated colleague and exponent of the Oxford theory that we've had in the last decade. He's been marvelous, and he co-edited with John Shahan a wonderful edition called Shakespeare Beyond Doubt with a question mark, exposing an industry in denial, which was a response to a Birthplace Trust, Cambridge University, a book called Cambridge Beyond Doubt. So they gave the affirmative and we gave the question mark, and they helped organize a whole series of chapters that brought all that together. I don't believe that book is available anymore online. I do wish it would be reprinted and published again, because it has such marvelous ways of responding. And it turns out that the book that Shahan and Waugh edited with the question mark well outsold the Cambridge University edition that the Birthplace Trust put together to try to defend the traditional narrative. And their articles were ridiculous. I would not recommend anybody buy the Cambridge University edition of that book. It's state-sponsored propaganda defending the realm, defending Shakespeare as the author. And, of course, King Charles, it was the president or the leader, the chairman of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, and so he's not in on it. But his father, on the other hand, Prince Charles, Prince Philip, he was a doubter of the attribution, and when asked why, he said to Stanley Wells, whose book was The Birthplace, published by Cambridge University, because of your book, sir. It was so full of trash that it led me to absolutely doubt that your guy could have written it. So Prince Philip was in on it. King Charles, regrettably, is not on our side in this argument. So, but in England, it's a much harder argument to make. In America, I think in the States, you could be a Shakespeare doubter and not be thrashed in the media. In England, however, you can get really thrashed by the media if you try to raise doubt about it. And our colleague Roz Barber has gone through quite a passage because of things she wrote in response to somebody's objecting to Elizabeth Winkler and Derek Jacobi speaking at the London Library. So there are very, very, very sensitive spirits out there that will take you to court if you say the wrong thing. Roz's massive online course on the authorship question that's sponsored by Coursera through the University of London is available online, and I don't know how many thousands of people have done her course, but it's a wonderful course. If you really want to look into this, Roz Barber did produce it. It's still available online through Coursera. It's about the Shakespeare authorship, and she interviews Mark Rylance and a number of other scholars, and has a 8-week course on this that is worthy of, if you're really curious about this, to watch it. I think she may have passed 10,000 people who have registered for her course. So there's a hunger for this, and if you have any connection to Shakespeare, if you love the plays, if you go to the plays, if you watch the videos, if you ever read the plays, this is the place where you could really get excited and find new interest and new stimulation. And I would hope that younger people would be excited about this subject. But again, at the university levels, you do not find an open-mindedness about it, and you do not find English departments that are teaching Shakespeare in the way that it was taught, say, 50 years ago, or in specialty universities like where I went, where you had a lot of teachers who were able to teach Shakespeare. It's hardly in the curriculum at any of the major universities at all these days. So the audience from the theater is where you'll find the people who are interested in this subject more than the literary circles that are university centered. So this is again a plebeian approach to it, that we're not the people who have advanced degrees in Shakespeare scholarship, but we're the people sitting in the theater who are amazed by the works and are thirsty to know more about what's behind them and who wrote him and what he was all about. And with the Earl of Oxford, you have a very complex and a fascinating character, and tragical, really, in his life. Never received any significant military honors or diplomatic service in any way. He was probably a hothead, and some people would have probably thought of him as bipolar. So there is various theories about his personal life that would help explain that. John Paul Stevens, his comment on the question of who the Earl of Oxford was, because he led this somewhat profligate life and made one of the maids of honor pregnant during the time he was estranged from his wife, and ended up in the Tower of London with the mother and Vavasor and the babe, and then gets into all sorts of hot water for other things. Accused his cousins of being Catholic, and then it's conspiring against Queen Elizabeth, and then they published these libels against him, which are used by historians, namely Alan Nelson, to besmirch the reputation of the Earl of Oxford. So he provoked huge admiration and huge dismay at the same time, depending on what side of the argument you want to be on. So he's a very interesting character, and theories abound about whether he was connected in any romantic way to the Queen, whether he was, and Catherine has some belief that the third Earl of Southampton may have been the illegitimate royal bastard son of the Earl of Oxford with Queen Elizabeth. I am doubtful of that theory, but
that was
I
an
have
anonymous.
great respect. Yeah, I have great respect for Catherine's sincerity and her belief, and I just don't quite share that part of her belief. But pretty much everything else she's into, I'm 100% with her. So kudos to Catherine, because she's you meet serious people who are dedicating an unbelievable part of their life to looking into arcane literature from the 16th century. It's such an odd, thing to be doing with your free time, but I've met 100 people doing this kind of thing, and I'm with them, and I want to be part of that group, because there's a vitality about it and a sincere willingness to share, and a sense that occasionally we even get a revelation that comes toward us at a conference or through a paper that we've read, or I've always been open, and everything I've ever written have come from inspiration that I've taken from what other people have shared, and usually in a conference or some email that they say, "Oh, you look into this one. What do you think about that one?" I've even sat in a tavern, not like the Mermaid Tavern of Universal Knowledge that people refer to all the time, thinking that Shakespeare picked up his Greeks from conversations over a pint. But that I was in after our conference in Ann Arbor, I was with Professor Brian Bechtold and Stuart Green, one of his students, that had come to our conference in Ann Arbor, and we were seeing Royal Shakespeare Company production. It was a wonderful conference where we saw productions from the Royal Shakespeare Company in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And he says, what do you think, Earl, about Much Ado About Nothing? I mean, the ending of that is a lot like The Winter's Tale. Well, you ought to look into that. And sure enough, I looked at that, and no doubt an even greater understanding of Shakespeare's use of Greek sources grew out of that conversation. But it took me a year of going home and looking through the Variorum editions and finding other classical allusions and references within The Winter's Tale that really confirmed the case. So, a conversation in a pub might make you go to the library, but it's not going to tell you the whole story, so you can write it down and create a credible narrative in a play as nuanced and beautiful and crafted in that exquisite mimetic form that Shakespeare was unique. I mean, to include classical allusions mixed in with medieval romance and, Renaissance literature integrated all together. Chaucer, mixed in with, Lucian and of course you got to put some Seneca and then Terence and Plautus, and then you've got Robert Greene and Thomas Ashe and other people writing in Renaissance that you want to hit on their stuff too. So these plays were the highest art was that mimetic magic in which they brought forward the ancient art and mixed it in with Renaissance reinterpretations that included an acknowledgement, a self-consciously literate acknowledgement of the root of the story, of the narrative, and that for literate people would be a true inspiration and a demonstration of literary mastery that went beyond just the words you're hearing. And so Shakespeare's plays were written for a highly educated audience. And, of course, the records we have is that the plays that were performed at court outnumber the ones we have that were known to have been performed in the public theater. So, the level of achievement in mixing these forms together is totally unique, and it was considered the highest form of art of that time. And we are not well aware of the sources until you really dive into them. And like I said, I only really studied the classics because of Shakespeare. I mean, sure, I knew the Iliad and the Odyssey. Read those in college and the Aeneid,
right.
But I didn't read a lot of the other material that Shakespeare used. And now, in my 8th decade, I'm still fascinated in reading the material that has been an inspiration for 400 years, and the art form continues to instruct.
When I went down to the county library today to pick up a interlibrary loan that came in, they said, hey Mark, you have like 2 minutes. We have to close. There was a septic problem. Figures, that you show up. You probably caused it. But when you go to Headingham Castle, or the Burghley House, Cecil House, What do how do they react to like you and Alex, Catherine showing up? Is it like these people are kind of troublemakers, or it's like, wow, they're giving us some much needed coverage? How do they respond to you guys?
I think we have. In the case of Burghley House, we have a very special case. And I'll give you a little story. The first year, back in 2003, or the winter of 2004, so it's actually 20 years ago, I was taking my second Shakespeare class and beginning to work on my paper on Hamlet. And I was pretty excited. And I was making the discoveries that would lead me down this road that's been going on for 20 years, because it was rich in the discoveries that could be made and in the stimulation I was receiving that led me to write and read more and more. So I was asked to meet with a doctor and another community activist to talk about a medical question they had regarding creating a nonprofit transport service for non-emergent patients. And since I had been practicing medicine in the county area for 40 years, they relied on me to, have some opinion on that. I came in and I was sitting with Dr. Robin and Barbara, and we were having our pint of ale and talking. And they said, "Well, Earl, how have you been enjoying your retirement?" I said, "Well, I'm so excited. I'm working on a paper on Hamlet, and I'm learning so much about the English Renaissance and the incredible rebirth of classical knowledge and the translations that were going on during that time. It just astounds me that all of a sudden there was this huge upsurge of interest in Old Greek and Roman culture and coming to affect what was going on in Shakespeare's time." And I rattled off in the books that were dedicated, the people who were supporting this, like William Cecil and all that, and my friend Dr. Robin looks at me and said, "Well, do you know who you're talking to? Barbara Cecil?" I said, "Oh, are you related to the Cecil family?" "Well, I happen to be married to Michael Cecil, who's the Marquis of Exeter." And I said, "Wait a minute. I am sitting with the wife of the Marquis of Exeter. You are Lady Burghley?" And she says, "That's right. I am Lady Burghley." And I said, "Oh my gosh, what a incredible happenstance, serendipity of the highest order, just by saying his name as being in a complimentary way, because he was really responsible for so much of that intellectual revolution that was going on. And although he was the Earl of Oxford's father-in-law and somewhat of a torment to the Earl personally, and not necessarily on the greatest of terms through many of the years that they were in close relationship. But I said the right thing. So I got invited to tea at the house, and I met Michael Cecil, who became interested in our program, and actually in 2010 came and gave a talk and brought out the Certain Precepts book that is mentioned in Hamlet, and he became somebody that was part of our collective. And so when I went to Burghley House in Great Britain, where Michael's cousin lives, we were well received and given a personal tour. And, I had a great exchange with John Culverhouse, who was the curator out there and the man who managed the estate. We got a first-class tour there. So that was an unusual reception. But I don't think we would have gotten a similar greeting in Stratford-upon-Avon at all. But Mark Rylance, who's an authorship doubter, was the artistic director at Shakespeare's Globe for a decade before he went back to full-time acting and started winning Olivier and Tony Awards and Academy Awards.
Wow.
So his career as an actor, besides being a brilliant Shakespeare actor, took off after he left going at the Globe. But one of the things that Mark didn't like about the Globe's policy is that they would not allow any of the authorship books to be sold in their bookstore, and that was one of the things I think that broke his relationship with the Globe, the new Globe board. Apparently, it was the question of whether you could bring anything that referred to the authorship challenge in as part of their little bookstore that was part of the complex there at the Globe Theater, which is an incredibly lovely reinvention of the traditional place scene. And I'll have to tell you, if you go to London, do go to the Globe to see a show. You could be among the people standing in the people who come for a penny, or you can pay 2 pennies and sit up in one of the stands. We saw a production of Macbeth there that was compelling, and with all this live music that was just gorgeous, played on the traditional instruments. It was a stunning production. And at the very end, one of the witches played a dirge on a fiddle, and the energy of the whole 1,000 people that were watching it just sunk. And then, because she reminded us through music that we'd seen a great tragedy in which many, innocent people died, and then the whole cast comes out with drums and fifes and does this vigorous dance, and the energy goes up into the sky, up to the open sky, and the gates open, and then you rush out onto the banks of the Thames, and it's just it was a wonderful experience of drama in the traditional Shakespeare form. Now, I know under the new leadership at the Globe, it's maybe not going to be quite so traditional, but it sure was a wonderful experience to get it the way it was intended to be as a creative art, and see how much you could do with a simple stage and no props and no special effects and live music, which was a stunning addition to the feeling that could be conveyed through music of the production. And that's the other thing that Shakespeare had in spades. The Earl of Oxford was known for his musical skills. John Farmer said he was as good as a professional in terms of his musical talent and knowledge. And so music is a deeply invested in the Shakespeare plays. There's a huge number of musical metaphors scattered throughout the canon, and music is performed, whether it's to lute and romantic songs, or drum and fife and horns for more martial experiences. There were tuckets that were played for the different characters that would come and go. I mean, the musical stuff in Shakespeare was quite remarkable, and that's another key element of Oxford's life, that he was a well-trained musician.
Well, okay, and obviously some of the training would be based on experiences, and I did want to work in Shakespeare by another name, and there's on the cover of the Oxfordian volume 24, there's the Titian's Venus and Adonis, and Mark Anderson does write, in the words of art historian Erwin Panofsky, Shakespeare's words sound like a poetic paraphrase of Titian's composition. So, when Catherine, it might have been when you two were on a couple months ago, she mentioned, the Titian's painting has such unique characteristics, like the hat.
Yes, the bonnet. Yes, the bonnet. That's it.
That the author of the poem, Venus and Adonis, had to have seen the painting. So there we are with traveling to the continent, and throughout the continent in Italy. So Mark has 20 some pages or more of the adventures he had across the continent. We're down to like 11 minutes or so, but is there something from what Mark documents in his book that adds even more conclusive proof that the real author of these plays had musical experiences, or knew the French courtly language for Henry V, or saw the Titian painting, because there's the traditional legend that Shakespeare never left England?
Oh yes, well, there's a lot that could be said about all those subjects that you mentioned there, but the Italian connection in Shakespeare is deep, and the Venetian connection is deep, and so we've got, the Earl of Oxford did spend time in Venice and did travel throughout northern Italy, and did actually, probably get as far as Sicily and maybe even the east coast of Genoa. He may have made it that far, but he traveled extensively for a year in Italy, and the specificity of the Titian mention of the bonnet in Venus and Adonis, that is the one unique copy of that painting, The Birth of Venus, or Venus and Adonis, that has that cap, was in that Venetian studio that Oxford probably would have visited. We don't know what he was doing in Venice, but we do know that he went to the Church of Santa Maria Formosa. We have evidence of that, and he brought home an Italian boy who was a beautiful singer and who spent a year in England as his page, and then went back to Italy. And we have testimony from Orazio Quacco about how the Earl of Oxford treated him with great kindness, introduced him to the court of the Queen. He sang for them. He admitted that he was allowed to practice his own Catholic religion while living with Oxford, and that Oxford knew Italian and Latin fluently. So we have that direct connection in that church. Well, another officer in that church is a man named Gaspar Ribeiro, who was a converso. He was a Portuguese Jew who converted to Catholicism, moved to Venice with his family, owned the meat monopoly there, and according to a scholar named Brian Pullen, writing beautifully about this, he's the model for Shakespeare's Shylock. He had a daughter that ran off to marry a Christian. There was thousands of dollars of ducats that were stolen by the son-in-law when they came to arrest Gaspar, who was tried in the Venetian court for apostasy and posthumously convicted. But his life and his character is well elucidated in those archival passages that Pullen pulled out of the Venetian Inquisition and of his trial, and he fits the model of Shylock perfectly. And he would have been in that church at the same time that the Earl of Oxford was there. So for me, that's about as rich a topical connection, because the Earl of Oxford was in the business of borrowing money at that time, and Ribeiro was a notorious usurer, Jewish moneylender. If you were Jewish, and he was a converso, so he's Catholic now, Jewish moneylenders could only lend a maximum of 3 ducats. Well, Antonio wanted 3,000 ducats, okay? A man like Ribeiro would make a 3,000 ducat loan, and in fact, he sued a Christian. He was sued by a Christian for usurious charging on a 3,000 ducat loan earlier. So he fits the profile for Shylock perfectly, and I believe that's another topical allusion. But you've got other things that come up throughout that Italian tour. The murals in Padua at the great estates there were described in the Rape of Lucrece. So you have topical commentaries that tie in with the specific artwork that the Earl of Oxford and the specific people he was meeting while on tour in Italy. And, of course, the Commedia dell'arte was a performance art that he certainly would have seen. And, in fact, there was a commedia written with a character playing the Earl of Oxford challenging anybody to fight him in a duel that was apparently performed in Sicily. So he was part of that Italian dramatic culture, and we received that instruction, that information. And so many of the commedia influences within the Shakespeare canon seem to come directly from Oxford's pen in the years after he returned from Italy. So we could trace his life adventure and tie them closely over and over and over again to the works of Shakespeare. And it's a never-ending story. And Marco Anderson's book is critical. He has 180 pages of endnotes. In James Shapiro's book about contested will, there's no annotated index. There's an annotated bibliography in which he mentions books he thinks that were referenced, and that's the only place he mentions Margo Anderson's book. It's only as a footnote at the end of his book. But in the original Shakespeare by Another Name, 180 pages of endnotes. It shows you exactly how much work went into identifying and documenting the veracity of the description of the Earl of Oxford's life that he puts together. It's a beautifully written book. I've read it twice. It's been quite a few years since I read it, but apparently he's working on a possible second edition. So we could be very, very blessed to have that come forth in the years ahead. But he's still engaged, still involved. He was at our conference in New Orleans last year, speaking on publishing his book. And so we have the most marvelous, dedicated, self-motivated autodidacts in the world working on this problem of the mystery of where did the works of Shakespeare come from. And it's something your listeners, if you love literature, if you love history, there's not a better story to be told than the one that we've been kind of wandering around in the last couple hours. It's changed my life to be part of this, but then I had the freedom to get inspired by seeing those plays and somehow just landed in the right place at the right time by serendipity and met the right people and have had a marvelous experience of sharing and expanding the breadth of knowledge that's part of the story. If I can contribute one or two tiny tiles to that mosaic, I will have accomplished something in this lifetime that's worthy of remembrance. So, I'm still working on that. I have a collection of essays I'd like to publish in a book form in the coming year, Mark. When I get that done, I'll give you a call and we can have another conversation.
Yeah. We want you back for that.
That would be great. That would be a lot of fun.
We ventured into a bunch of new topics. We have like 4 minutes left. What is some of the latest news from the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship? I saw where there's a job application for Jacobean lawyers.
Yes, that came out today, didn't it? Yeah, we wanted an expert who knows something about the law of England during the time of Shakespeare's. We have attorney. We have Dorothea Dickerman is an attorney on our board, and Alex McNeil is, of course, a retired attorney that practiced in Massachusetts. So, and Tom Renier, who was our past president, is no longer with us. He passed away in the early years of COVID. But we had a lot of great lawyers involved with us, but we don't have anybody that's a specialist in English law from that era. But we do have a book on Shakespeare and the law that is published in the Brief Chronicles series by editor Roger Strittmatter. So people go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website and enter the Shakespeare and the law. They'll be sent to that, and for under $20, you can get a collection of essays, including several by Tom himself. George Greenwood's essay, fabulous questioning, raising the question of authorship and the legal knowledge that's reflected in those books, in those works. So we do actually have some pretty good documents on that, but it would be nice to have some modern historian who knows something about the law of the 16th century to help with interpreting some of the questions that do come up. So, yeah. It just shows you that we're a serious, the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship is a serious organization with serious people looking into questions as honestly as they can, and without any expectation of receiving great accolades or financial gain from it. It is a pure, amateur adventure. We are professional in our work. But we're unpaid professionals in this regard because it comes from the love we have for the adventure, not only of experiencing the art itself, but to having some insider position on understanding how it was put together and the miraculous material from which he drew and how did he get his hands on that. And, I just think that you get behind the mask of the author in a way if you're into this that you don't get, and it enhances your appreciation and understanding immensely of the plays. And there's one program that we've put together in the past year called Shakespeare Illuminated, which is Professor Michael Delahoyd from Washington State University giving monthly talks on the Shakespeare plays. He recently did one on Macbeth, and he had readers from England and in the States reading different passages from it. It was very exciting. It was like watching a production of Macbeth with interpretation of passages in between from an Oxfordian standpoint by a knowledgeable professor. It was a fun hour. It was more than an hour. It was really a good time. And I hope some of these Shakespeare Illuminated series will be available on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship YouTube channel. But there's, for people interested in pursuing this, there's plenty of material out there that exists online today that didn't exist 10 years ago. 10 years ago, none of this existed, and now we have a huge library out there that's available to people who are curious about this whole question. And I would encourage it because it's electrifying, it's enlivening, and you get to see where expertise is misguided, and that we've been gaslighted on who Shakespeare is for 400 years, and it's time for us to wake up and realize there's a different way of seeing this whole thing. And thank you, Mark, and thank you, Barbara, for making it possible for me to have this extended conversation. I feel like we've just scratched the surface, but it's been a delight.
We'll do it again when you get your book out. Thanks everyone
Mark.
for tuning in. Thanks, Earl, and we'll see everyone soon.